If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, we're going to do something a little different today, and I felt compelled to this because, not that I want to stop going through Acts, I want to finish the book of Acts, but we're going to take a departure from it, and we're going to turn, and if you find it helpful, to 1 Peter chapter 2. This is where we will start, and there'll be a lot of scriptures, and so it may be that you find it helpful not to follow along, but to just hear them read. But I want to speak today, and I don't generally like topical sermons because to me they detract somewhat from what the Bible would say. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to say to all of us, does the Bible give us a proper perspective on what civic responsibility is? And I'm going to say it does. And I think not only for the standpoint of we as Christians, when we go into a voting booth or we pick up a sign and carry it, whatever we do, we who walk with Jesus should have that walking with Jesus informs us as we go into that choice, to make a choice to vote or to make a choice to carry a sign or whatever it is we're going to do, or to send money to a candidate. Well, at the pre-election time we all went through, we were left with two different groups. On the one hand, the Group A said of Group B, if they get elected, the country's doomed. Group B said of Group A, if they get elected, the country's doomed. I don't think it would have doomed the country either way. And the reason I say that is the Bible gives us a really proper perspective on what it is how we should view civic responsibility. And so what I want to do today, without plumping for any candidate or ideology whatsoever, is to say, what does the Bible say about this? And I think it's important because the biblical perspective gives us a grounding that this world does not have. Let's look at this text. I'll begin in verse 13 of 1 Peter 2. Submit yourselves, therefore, for the Lord's sake, to every authority instituted among humanity, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to the governors who are sent by the king to punish those who do wrong, to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of the foolish. Live as free, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for vice. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the believers. Fear God. Honor the king. Now, what does this text tell us about civic responsibility? First thing I got to say is I'm making an assumption here today. I'm looking around this room and I'm assuming that everybody in here has come to that place where they've said yes to Jesus and they're followers of Jesus. That's my assumption. If you haven't done that, then today's a really good day to get that straightened out. So I want to plant that. If you want to say yes to Jesus today, we'll be happy to facilitate that. I or anybody else in this room who knows the Lord would be happy for that. But what would be the responsibilities civically to which we would adhere if we are believers? Well, the text says we're to obey the civic authority. Now, that opens up a huge container of difficulties, because what if the civic authority is Pol Pot? How do you obey that? That is not what the Bible is indicating here. The civic authority, this is where we misread this, and so I want you to follow with me very carefully. God, and I say this with reverence, the Bible says God, we'll see in a few moments, chooses the authorities. Please understand, it's not saying He's choosing the people. You've got to see that. He might. I'm not saying He never does, but I'm saying we can't look at every election and every process and say God picked so-and-so, because that is not the case. What God has chosen is civic authorities. Period. We live in a country where we have the rule of law. God has deemed that all of fallen flesh will have civic authorities to which we are responsible. That doesn't mean they're right, but it means He chooses that there will be government of humanity, because that's where we are now in the history. We've said no to God. We said no to that government a long time ago in a garden. And so here we are now needing some kind of governance to keep us from eating each other up. God has said yes to that. So God has chosen the authorities that we obey. We're to live as free people. But we don't see that as a license to vice. There's a restraint there. Did you know this country was founded with an assumption? I don't care what anybody who speaks on this matter thinks about the way this country was founded. Whether it was founded as a Christian nation. I don't see that. I mean, if you go back and read the founders, they founded it as a nation wherein they grounded our freedom in the fact that we're made in the image of God. That's as far as it went. They never intended for this to be a theocratic nation where we were governed by Christianity. Never. They wanted those things separated. They wanted the sphere of government to be informed by the fact that people have these beliefs, but they never wanted it to be a country wherein the country said, this is the church you will be part of, or this is the belief system you'll adopt. They never wanted that. But they did found this country with the assumption that the people who are voting and the people who attain office are virtuous. Virtue was the foundation of this country. Well, why should we be shocked that we're in the trouble we're in? Because we are not virtuous as a nation. You've heard me say it before, and it's worth saying again, I think. God bless America. You see it on church signs everywhere. No, America bless God. That is the rubric under which we live. If we're not blessing God, do not expect that God can endorse who we are. Now, I realize that for us in this room, we sit on the other side of that and we say, Lord, we want what you want. At least we think we do. Our hearts are that way, even if we're wrong. But that is not the general tenor of the country. And so God cannot say America is the best place in His mind, because we're not doing that. We've aborted 40 million and counting children. 60 now. My figures are wrong then. I mean, 1.5 million a year since Roe v. Wade. And that still goes on. So I don't understand how we say, God bless America. I don't see how He can. I wouldn't bless Jackson if he were out knocking off 7-Elevens. I couldn't do it. But our freedom flows from just what He says. Verse 16, our obedience. We're going to be free, we've got to obey, or we don't deserve the freedom that we have. And that says something to you and to me that I think we miss. It says we know something about what God says, and we know something about the law, and we know how those two things fit. That means we've got to be biblically aware, studied up. And if we're not, again, that freedom is going to be shunted, taken, shortchanged for us, cut off. Now I want to read another text here this morning. It follows along with this one. It's found in Romans chapter 13. This is where Paul steps into this conversation. And he makes some very clear statements about the civic authorities. He says this in verse 1. Everyone must submit themselves to the governing authorities. There is no authority except that which God has established, which is what I said a moment ago. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he or those who rebel against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. Those who do so will bring judgment on themselves, for the rulers hold no terror for those who do what is right, but for those who do what is wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and the authority will commend you. The authority is God's servant to do you good, but if you do what is wrong, be afraid. The authority does not bear the sword for nothing. The authority is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on wrongdoers. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to these authorities, not only because of the possible punishment, but also because of conscience. That is why you pay taxes. The authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, respect. Then respect them. If honor, then honor them. Now, that's a hard text because it tells you and me, look, we had I shouldn't comment on that. We had a praise service for the outcome of the election. That's fine. Would we have had it if the election had gone the other way? Why? If I'm reading this text correctly, it is God who has set the governing authorities in place. Now that doesn't mean the people. Do I think that there was a right and a wrong in this election? I do. But that's personal to me. I'm not God. God has set these authorities in place. The authority comes from Him. What does that mean? We are to obey. Look at the text. We are to obey not merely to avoid the punishment. Now, I shouldn't say it. How many people put a radar detector on their dash? Why do we do that? To avoid obeying because of conscience. We only want to obey so far as we don't get caught. The penalty for getting caught doing that, and you could multiply that 1,000 times. How many people sit down when it comes to be December, I don't know when you do it, I do it in December, and fill out their tax forms and say, you know, that few $100s that somebody gave me, I'm not going to report that. Nobody's going to catch us probably. Nobody's going to say anything. Might go through our whole life totally free from any punishment. But there was somebody who saw that happen. God saw that happen. Where does it touch our conscience? That's why Paul and Peter place all of this obedience to the authorities within the realm of conscience. What does our conscience say? We know when we're messing up. And so the obedience comes not to just avoid the punishment. It comes because we as followers of Jesus are willing to pay a price of obedience to the civic authorities in order to be a follower of Jesus and to express that in the civic realm. That's why when somebody says to me, I'm not even going to vote, I say, well, then you need to keep your mouth shut when things don't go the way you think. You've no right to complain because you didn't exercise the minimal civic responsibility. The Bible has a lot more to say to us. And this is where this perspective becomes more important to me than any one election or anything else. And I hope that it'll wash over you to a degree such that you'll begin to see what the Bible is expressing here. Listen very carefully to these words. It's Isaiah chapter 40. You don't have to look it up unless you want. I'll begin reading in verse 15. Behold, the nations are a drop in the bucket. They are accounted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, God takes up the islands as very little things. Lebanon is not sufficient to burn all of the trees on it, nor the animals of it sufficient for a burnt offering before God. All of the nations are as nothing before God. They are accounted by Him as less than nothing and worthless. Now that's a hard word for us to hear because we send people to fight for this country. We pay taxes to this country. We go through campaigns for this country. We do all kinds of things for this country. But some people interpret that text and they say, well, the Bible is telling us we should have no love of this country. That is not what it is saying at all. That is not what it is saying. That is false. When Jeremiah was living in Babylon, watched Jerusalem be destroyed, watched the temple burned, he prophesied. And you can read that for yourself in Jeremiah 29. He said to the people then at that time, he said, you need to pray for the welfare of Babylon. Did the Jews love Babylon? I don't think they did. The Orthodox Jews did not love Babylon. They hated it. Jeremiah says, you pray for Babylon. Pray for the welfare of this nation in order that you will do well in this nation. You see, there is a sense of love of country, but it goes far deeper than just waving a flag. It goes into something that says something about you and me as followers of Jesus. We are to pray for the welfare of this country, and that would go for us no matter who sits in the Oval Office, or who sits in the Senate seat, or who occupies the county seat, or wherever the government official is that we might violently disagree with. We are to pray for the welfare of this country, and we're to pray for the one in the office. I didn't hear much of that on this election time. I didn't hear many people saying we need to pray no matter who gets in. I didn't hear that. I heard a lot of terrible things being said. That seems to me to not be what the Bible is telling us to do. Now, we have a further responsibility, and Paul gives it to us. He says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, we're going to put all these pieces together when I close this down, so try to hang in there with me. He says to the church at Thessaloniki, and they had their problems. They were another Gentile church in the Roman Empire. He says, you, brothers and sisters, never be weary in doing what is right. We have a responsibility to do what is right, which means, if it means anything that I see as a responsibility civically that is going to change this country, town, city, county, for whatever reason, whatever group of people I see, and I see something done in front of me that needs to be done in order to make things right, I need to do that, even if it causes me sacrifice. I'm just going to give you, to connect all these pieces in a grid so that they make sense to us. I want to give you what I see as the Bible's 7 things that we need to do in order to obey these texts and to understand them properly and to have the proper perspective. How do you connect a war with God seeing our nation as a drop in a bucket? We have to do that work mentally. We have to. We have an obligation to it. So here are the 7 things that I see as the need for us to if you want to have a grid that connects all of this, this is the grid. Seek to obey all of the laws that do not contradict that which God would command. No matter what. If they're inconvenient, we obey them. If we don't like the person in office, we obey them. If we disagree with the way the money is being spent, we pay the taxes. We do what we're supposed to do because God commands it of us. Number 2 follows on the heels of that. That means study. We have to study to be as certain as possible about what God's commands are, so that when the civic authorities contradict them, we can even know where the contradictions are. I mean, if we don't know anything about what the Bible says, and we think that this is ungodly, how do we know that? Can we articulate it? Have we thought it through? A lot of the things I hear say, no, we have not. Number 3, honor the civic authorities. Now, this one is hard. This means, I remember this like it was yesterday because I was part of it. I remember a billboard driving down Route 322 in Pennsylvania when Bill Clinton was president. It was put up there by I don't know what group. I couldn't read the fine print on the sign. Probably they intended that no one would be able to read the fine print, I'm guessing, unless you got up there with the sign or had binoculars while you're driving. It said, if his lips are moving, he is lying. Of Bill Clinton. That is not honoring Bill Clinton. He is the president. Am I praying for him? Am I honoring that office as the civic authority? No. I'm saying everything he says is a lie. That's impossible. That is impossible that everything he would say would be a lie. Can't happen. Pay the taxes that are due. Pay no more than are necessary, right? I heard someone say to me in just recent weeks, I said, well, we have envelopes. I don't know if you notice these little plastic things on the back of the pews are envelope. So, and some of them say stuff that don't have anything to do with what's going on right now. Like we got the Lottie Moon Easter offering envelopes, and we got the Thankful Heart envelopes with children's homes and things like that. They're just envelopes. They're the only ones I could find. If you have an offering in cash and you want to give it, that's great. But you should be benefiting from the fact that right now in this country, churches are 501c3. They are tax exempt. And you get a benefit on your taxes for having given. You should accept that. I heard somebody say, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm thinking, why? It's the law. Now, it may come 10 years from now, it's not legal. But right now, it's legal. Pay the taxes that are due, but don't pay those which you're not responsible for. That just seems to me to be bad stewardship, personally. Seek the welfare of the neighborhood, the town, the state, the country. How do you do that? Pray for the leaders, number 6. Number 5, seek the welfare. How do we do that? Number 6, pray for the leaders. Pray for them, just as Ed said. We have a new president. Pray for that president. I hope you've been praying for the one that's there. I hope you've been praying for the Congress people that are there. If we're not praying for our president and for the leaders from county to local to federal, shame on us. Shame on us. Work for the welfare of the nation and its inhabitants. This goes right back to what Paul said to the church at Thessaloniki. Never tire of doing what is right. That may mean we write letters to Congress. We write letters to our congressperson. I'm cynical. I hate to say it, but I am. And when I hear complaints about what's going on at the State House, my first question always is going to be, so don't ever say it to me, have you written a letter? Have you done something about that, or are you just going to wring your hands and complain? Don't bother me with it. I'm not interested. If we're not willing to do something, then we have no right to complain about it. Don't we teach our children that? Do we not teach children that? Don't complain about it. Don't complain about the leaves in the yard if you're not going to go out there and start raking them up. Don't complain about your room being messy if you're not going to clean it. We teach children that, but then we grow up. And somehow that just doesn't matter anymore. That may mean that we have to write that letter and write it again and write it again and write it again. It may mean that we have to actually, and I say this, there are people called to this. It may mean that you or I or somebody we know, you know what, I'm going to run for city council. I feel called of God to run for city council. It's going to cost my family. It's going to cost me. I talked to a city council person day before yesterday, for an hour. This city council person lost their election. While they were in office, they were threatened. Their family was followed. Their daughters were followed. They had death threats on the telephone. Terrible messages left at their house. But this council person felt called to serve. It's a costly thing. And it might mean that you have to take a sign and go out and join an organized protest. If there's something you disagree with so much and there's no other recourse for you, you might have to grab a sign and stand there with it and protest. That's a legal right we have to criticize the government. Where does all this fit into a biblical, and I'll use a 50-cent word, epistemology, a biblical worldview? Where does it fit? Let this list be weighed in the balance of these thoughts. Isaiah 40, the nations are a drop in the bucket. That's a big one. To God, nations come and go. We are aware that this world is not all there is. Right? And we're looking for something greater and surer and far more permanent than this country or any other country. I want to just walk you through a short history lesson here, just to give us a perspective, God's perspective. Assyria that attacked, you remember Assyria attacked Hezekiah, attacked the northern kingdom, deported. That's how the Samaritans came to be Samaritans. The northern kingdom was deported in large numbers, and large numbers of Assyrians came into the northern kingdom and intermarried. And so the southern kingdom Jews, who stayed pure as Jews, even though they saw the same things happen, they never let go of their Judaism. In the northern kingdom, they did, and they were always seen as mongrels. The Assyrian Empire lasted for 1,900 years. That's a long time. The Babylonian Empire came and went for 1,300 more. Persia lasted for 200. Greece lasted for about 200. And it split into 4 under the Ptolemaic kingdoms when the 4 generals took Alexander's empire and split it into 4 sections. And then that divided into 2 with the Seleucids. And then the Romans came along. For 200 years that was going on. Then the Romans showed up. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, lasted for 900 years. The Western lasted for 500. Where are they now? Where are any of these kingdoms now? If you go over to Western Europe, what do you see? You see a whole bunch of countries Britain's pulled out of the EU. Greece is threatening to. Other countries are saying we don't need this European Union. They're not unified. They're fighting amongst each other. They all recognize their own country as the only country on the earth that has any real meaning. The nations are a drop in the bucket. That's you and me too. Listen carefully to what the Scripture says to us. Hebrews chapter 11. Talking about all those people who gave up so much to be faithful to God. Those who say such things make it clear they are seeking after a country of their own. For indeed, if they'd been thinking of the country from which they came, they would have gone back. They had plenty of time to go back to it, but now they desire a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them. Hebrews 12, this phrase yet once more signifies the removing of those things which can be shaken. That's everything. This whole world can be shaken. Those things which are not shaken then can remain. Therefore, we receive a kingdom that can't be shaken. Let us have grace whereby we may offer service well-pleasing to God with reverence and awe. Hebrews 13, we don't have here an enduring city. I wonder, do we hear that? We do not have an enduring city here. We seek the city that's to come. These thoughts, in my mind at least, should govern our perspective completely. It should give us a perspective about elections. It should give us a perspective about the choices our government makes. It should give us a perspective about the way in which we're to look at that government as it makes those choices. When we find ourselves so incensed over what the government does, think on these things. We don't have an enduring city here. We do not. And if anything we remember, if you don't remember anything about this sermon, which may or may not be likely, I don't know, there is no panic in heaven with God over anything that's happening on this earth right now. There is no panic. I assure you that God sees it all. And He's not, oh, I've never thought of that before. If we keep these in our hearts, we'll know what it is to live in the civic sphere as followers of Jesus in this fallen world. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said